Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I am Jamie Moeller, and this is the Grad Connection, where my goal is to try to help graduate students do more than just survive. I want to see you thrive. The last several weeks, I can't remember how many weeks I've been doing this research series, but we're continuing on with that thread. We've kind of moved all the way through methodology, and so now I want to talk a little bit about specifically qualitative methodologies or qualitative approaches, and then I want to talk about quantitative approaches too. So in qualitative approaches, first and foremost, most of the qualitative approaches that exist kind of come out of humanities and sociology, anthropology, education, which is not necessarily humanities, but essentially these fields are the ones kind of where you see this come from. And what's happened is, interestingly, qualitative approaches has really proliferated lots of other fields. So it's not just limited to liberal arts or humanities anymore. And they're very valid approaches. The key is and particularly when you see somebody coming from a quantitative bent who's only ever lived in the quantitative world, often and historically there may have been some mudslinging between quantitative and qualitative. But they both have their place. They both have value. They both generate and do something of significance in the research end. So I'm a big believer that the two of them complement each other very well. If someone can get past their own biases of their own work and see the value in these things. So, but first and foremost, I would say the goal of qualitative, keep in mind, the goal of qualitative research is to generate theory, number one. Second, in my mind, it's also sometimes it's like identification or understanding of the variables that are at play in a particular situation. And also, just in general, it's also used to kind of explore new or novel areas that maybe there's not a whole lot of research in. So if you're talking about generating theory, extending theory, I mean, and the underpinnings of both of those is to understand the variables involved. Qualitative approach can be the appropriate one. So I wrote down a bunch of characteristics of qualitative research. I just got to talk through them. These are in no particular order, but when I think about qualitative research, these are the main things that kind of popped in my mind that are kind of significant points or points of note, I will say. So first and foremost, we talk about qualitative research is always human subjects oriented, and so as such, there's no hypothesis. You typically will have an emergent question. Sometimes you'll have maybe you start with a question, but that question basically evolves. Sometimes you may not even have a question. There may be no, like a research question. There may be an overarching, I want to understand this situation, and then that question may get more specific. But realizing that qualitative research is always human subjects, there are no hypotheses, and at best, or at most, you may start with a beginning question, but usually the research question emerges. So that's point number one. Second, qualitative research is comprised of narratives and of stories and of artifacts. Usually, I mean, you have to keep in mind that qualitative research, the unit of measure are words and stories, as opposed to in a quantitative realm, the unit of measure is typically numerical, or at least some kind of quantification. So it's narrative and stories, and so oftentimes research in this vein gets very long because those stories are recorded and become part of the research. You usually have very small sample sizes. Something like a biography, which is a type of qualitative research, has a sample of one, or can have a sample of one. But generally, you're talking about smaller size samples, anywhere from 8 to 15 to 20. It just depends on which kind of qualitative research you're doing. But recognizing in quantitative realm, you're talking large numbers usually hundreds or maybe even thousands in a quantitative study. So in qualitative, a small sample size. Typically, is something that's typical of qualitative research, at least in the methodological kind of view, is that it's comprised of interviews, of focus groups. Typically, that's kind of the primary data collection mechanism, avenue, venue, whatever you want to call it. And typically, you're in a naturalistic environment, meaning the researcher is oftentimes directly engaged in the environment. In quantitative research, you want a distance between the researcher and the thing being research, because you're essentially trying to eliminate bias. Now, you never totally eliminate bias, but there's an arm length distance. In qualitative, you're right up in it. I mean, the researcher is in the environment, integrated into the environment, because the researcher is actually the tool or the lens through which the data is viewed. So recognizing that is a significant difference. Another thing I mentioned, interviews. Journaling is quite common, like where the researcher actually writes a journal as they move throughout the research. So that's common. Interviews, focus groups, journaling, right? Emergent design. Sometimes the design, in quantitative research, the whole point is to come up with a research question and hypotheses before, you basically establish everything before you ever do data collection. And it's not common. Typically, you don't want the methodology to change at all. Sometimes you may have a priori hypotheses in a quantitative research study, but you shouldn't be a habitual thing, right? And so essentially, quantitative research methodology is very rigid. The idea is that it doesn't change. You want it to be as solidified as possible. Qualitative, on the other hand, can emerge, and you can, as I like to call it, you can chase rabbits in the middle of your qualitative research. In other words, if you find something emerges, you can chase that and kind of deviate from what you originally planned in your research design. And that's quite common. Now, going back to the idea of researcher as the tool or the lens, realizing that you have to deal with bias, because every researcher has bias. And it's just assumed that there is bias in qualitative research. The point, how you deal with it, is making sure that that the researcher and their ideas, their perspectives, are listed, specifically written, and this is why a journal is important. You actually put that bias into the research. So in other words, it's like me taking off my glasses and describing my glasses to the degree that you could understand what it would be like to look at the world through my eyes. So rather than pretending that there is no bias or trying to cordon that off, in qualitative research, you typically draft out all of your biases, at least to the degree that you can. A lot of times that happens through journaling. And there are other mechanisms depending on what kind of study you're doing, but dealing with bias is just a normal thing in qualitative research. Trustworthiness is a concept in qualitative research, and what trustworthiness has to do with in qualitative research is the credibility of the researcher, how well they document their biases and put it out there so that you as the reader of that research can see through their glasses and all those kinds of things. Another concept that goes with qualitative research is this idea of the voices of the participants coming through the research. And so typically qualitative research has tons and tons of direct quotes from participants that support the findings of the research. Now, occasionally qualitative research will include some quantification, like frequency counts of words and those kinds of things, depending on what kind of tool you use and what approach you use for the analysis, the data analysis. Oftentimes you may be looking at the frequency of certain phrases and those kinds of things, because essentially in qualitative research, in some types of qualitative research, what you're doing is you're taking words that are said and you're looking for commonalities amongst them, and those become the themes or the emergent themes that come out of the research. Triangulation is another concept in qualitative research, and that is, triangulation is simply making sure or trying to see if the same findings emerge through multiple data sources. So like if you did interviews and you did focus groups, right? Do the findings that you find in one emerge in the other, so that you actually have triangulation, and typically it's three or more sources, even though I just listed two. Another thing you deal with in qualitative research is this idea of recording and transcribing. How are you going to record the words that people say, and how are you going to transcribe them? And I may do a video just on, kind of wrestling or grappling with that in qualitative research, because, the thing that you wrestle with is, okay, as a researcher, do I take the time, obviously I record it, but do I take the time to actually transcribe it myself? And there are benefits to that, or do I send it away and pay to have it transcribed? And there are benefits to that as well. But both of those also have weaknesses too. And then the last kind of word that I wrote down here is the idea of saturation. And so when you're doing qualitative research, kind of the idea is how, how many interviews do you do, how much data do you collect, and all that kind of thing. And saturation is the answer, right? So when you start in the data, in the stories that you receive from people, once you start seeing repetition within that, you're reaching what they call data saturation, or just plain saturation, meaning that you're not finding new information. And that's the point at which you know it's kind of time to stop collecting data, at least on that particular end or frame of, or that particular thing that you're collecting data on, because you've reached saturation. So this is a bunch of different words, and this was just kind of a brain dump that I did on things that stood out. It's not meant to be exhaustive, but at least to give you a flavor of kind of what are the unique points of qualitative research. Now, let's talk about qualitative methods. So what I would say about qualitative methods is there are a ton of them. Some people say there are 10 of them, some people say there are 5 of them, some people say there are 2 of them. There are 5 that, when I talk about qualitative research, I usually talk about 5. And this comes from a couple, and I'm a couple specific sources, and I forgot to dig them out, so I'm not going to try to remember the names. But there are basically 5 that I usually talk about: biography, ethnography, grounded theory, phenomenology, and case study. Those are kind of like, to me, the big 5. Now, if you read some sources, I would say, for whatever research question you have in qualitative research, there are hundreds of ways that you could approach it, and probably just as many methodologies that you could approach it from. So I'm just going to talk about those 5. So those are the qualitative methods. But in addition to those methods, you can also have what are called frames of reference, or lenses through which you do that work. And it usually, the lens through which you're doing that work usually has to do with the researcher and a particular perspective they have. So that lens could be a gender lens. It could be an ethnicity lens. It could be an orientation lens. It could be a nationality lens. It could be any diversity variable that is a part of the individual. That could be a perspective or a lens that's taken. That's typically how you see it. I think back to, I know there was, had a graduate student once in the research methods course that I taught. She was, and I can't remember if she was doing phenomenology or grounded theory, but I actually think it was phenomenology. But her research question is, what is it like for Hispanic women in the workplace in the United States? And she was a Hispanic woman. And so she had that unique frame, that unique lens through which she could view. So oftentimes when we talk about lenses, it's a particular perspective, if you will, of a particular individual, and it usually is associated with some diversity variable, some unique characteristic of, I could do, because and it doesn't just have to be the things. It could be because, let's say, I had talked about a long time ago, it would be really interesting to do an ethnographic study of what it's like to be a Westerner in an Eastern country. I did a lot of work in China, and so that was kind of how I would do. But I could bring it, because I'm a Westerner. I can bring that perspective to bear. Now I couldn't do the opposite, right? So to do these lenses, you typically have to have that characteristic or that unique perspective. Another way I could look at it is, what's it like to be a faculty member at a Research One institution? I'm a faculty member there, so I can have that perspective, right? So that's what I mean by lenses. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time talking about lenses. I really want to talk about the methods themselves. So let's talk about those. So there are 5. I said biography. So basically, a biography is research about one person. And really, the major aims, at least in my view, the major aims are to point out kind of what are the major milestones in that person's life, or the major things that person has dealt with, or the significance of decision points in that person's life. Usually you're trying to draw out some uniqueness about that individual and draw attention to that, and look at it through your lens. We had a graduate student who's now a faculty member at Purdue. He was doing research on a particular faculty member that was at Purdue that actually had a foot in civil engineering as well as in digital art at the early days of digital art. And so he did a biographical PhD, which was really kind of the first that I knew of in the Polytechnic, which used to be the School of Technology or College of Technology at Purdue. But nevertheless, that's what a biography. And so you could do a biography anywhere. So it doesn't just have to be limited to, going back to liberal arts and or humanities. although that's where it's most commonly used. Ethnography. Ethnography is basically the question driving it is what is that culture like? And it's usually from the frame or from the lens of the person engaging in that environment. The unique thing about ethnography is to be able to do an ethnographic study, oftentimes you have to engage yourself in that culture, in that environment for a lengthy period of time before you could actually do the research. So it's not unheard of for an ethnographic researcher to be engaged in the environment for 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 years or more as part of their research study. Now, realize that ethnography doesn't just have to, I mean, you can, most people are aware of researchers who've gone and lived in Africa or gone and lived in this environment or that environment, and even the one I mentioned a minute ago is what is it like to be a Westerner living in, let's say, China. It could be used that way, but understand ethnography could also be used in a technical sense too. Is, what's it like to be a faculty member trying to engage in business and industry in a Midwestern corporation or something. So you can be really creative with a lot of these different kinds of approaches, methodologies for qualitative research. Just depends on the question. It's all driven by the question, the research question that you're asking. So that's the ethnography. Grounded theory. At a conceptual level, it's really, what's going on here, which is very broad, right? This is really rooted in, it comes from a research study that was, the research study was tied, and there was a following book that called it, I forget the people that came up with this, but anyway, the book was called Awareness of Dying, and that was their research. And they were trying to understand that experience, right? So it attempts to take the experiences of people and distill it down to really understand what are the fundamental things going on there, to come up with a theory. Number 4 would be phenomenology, and this is what I did in my dissertation, so it's one that I'm most familiar with. But as opposed to what's going on here, it's more of the question of what is it like? And so the goal is to describe the essence of some experience. In my mind, the whole goal, the why I used it in my PhD was I was basically wanting to, if you gather enough stories of people about the experience that they had, you should be able to distill that down into some description. And then the last qualitative framework would be what I would call a case study. Now, I say there is a case study approach in quantitative research too, so this shouldn't be confused with that. But to me, the way I would describe a case study, it's a specific event at a specific place at a specific time with a specific set of people. And basically it's like understanding what's going on in that instance, as opposed to grounded theory is more like big picture, what's going on in a larger sense. Case study is to a specific situation, and usually with a specific set of people. I've often in technology research, I've seen this one used quite a bit because oftentimes it's trying to understand maybe there was a failed implementation of a software or a failed implementation of a policy or a successful implementation, but to try to understand the parameters of why it was succeeded or why it failed. That's typically how I've seen it used. So those are the 5 different methodologies that I would define. Again, if you do a Google search, you'll find 10. You can find people that define so many different types of qualitative research, and so don't just take, if you're wanting to do qualitative research and it really doesn't fit into any of the 5 that I've just mentioned. Now, I'd be surprised if it didn't fit into one of 5 that I mentioned. Just realize there are a whole bunch of different kinds of qualitative research out there. So as I said, some of these sources define it, lots of different things. So ultimately, I would say if you have something you want to explore, there's likely at least one method that you can use. But more than likely, there's probably a whole slew of different qualitative methodologies that you could use. And so the challenging thing, I think, with qualitative, and I'll just kind of end with this, is I think the challenging thing with qualitative is there are so many variations of the methodologies, and there are so many of the methodologies that could be used to answer a particular question. It can get confusing to kind of know which one to pick. And then after you pick the one, it can be also difficult to know how to approach as a procedure, as you gather data and you do your analysis and all that, because it's much looser in my mind. There's much more variability in qualitative research than there is in quant. So hopefully you found this video useful. Again, I appreciate people that drop me a line, let me know, people that ask questions about the content that I'm putting out there. Hopefully you find it useful. Probably next week, the topic's going to be on quantitative research, and then we'll see where we go from there. Have a great day. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.